Hey, welcome along to Life Switch Online. It is so good to have you with us. I hope you have had a fantastic week. Can I just tell you something really exciting we've been doing over the last couple of weeks is we've been in promoting Camp Survivor at 10 local schools, and it's been so good to be able to go in and have such incredible doors open for us to just invite kids along and make sure people know about Camp Survivor, because coming up in the April holidays we are all go for camp. Registrations are open for simply one more week. So if you know someone who is in that age group of 9 to 12, or you've got a child in that age, make sure you go along to campsurvivor.co.nz and register them. Or if you've got friends in that, let them know about camp, because it is such a cool opportunity. And honestly, thanks to people like you who support what we do here at Life Switch, we are able to go into the schools and just let people know all about camp. And honestly and sincerely, it goes so well. The kids love it. The teachers enjoy having us there, and it is so special. So can we just say thank you for making Camp Survivor happen? Hey, and one last request, as always here at Life Switch Online, why don't you say hi in the comments below? Let other people know that you're here. It's just always a better experience when you can just have the courage and be kind enough to say hi to others and they can say hi back. It really is so much better for everyone. Well, hey, let me dive into this today. We are in the final part of our Memoirs series, and I don't know about you, but I've loved this series of looking at these people that are often overlooked or misunderstood. And today we're going to look at the memoirs of a grateful girl, or memoirs of a grateful gal, as I've said it. And what I've loved about this series is as we've gone through each of these different people, you can see yourself. Well, I don't know about you, but I can see myself in these people. And maybe you've been joined with us for the whole series. Why don't you let us know in the comments below which one's been your favorite, which one stood out to you. But I think I'm really excited to bring this series to a close today, because I think we can really reinforce the big idea, the key point that we've been making throughout this series as we look at one final account. And in this account we find in the book of Matthew. I'm going to just read it through you, take you through it. And again, as we've been looking through these, you really can start to see ourselves in this picture. So I don't need to illustrate much up front. Let's just dive straight into what Matthew says. He says, while Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on Jesus' head as he was reclining at the table. So Jesus is sitting here at a table at the home of Simon the leper, and a woman comes and she gets this alabaster jar of expensive perfume and pours it on Jesus' head. And then the disciples saw this. They were indignant. They were like, what's going on here? Why this waste, they asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price, and the money could have been given to the poor. The disciples are watching this woman extravagantly pour this perfume on Jesus. And their first reaction is, why would you pour something so expensive on him? Because once the perfume comes out of the bottle, that perfume cannot be sold. We could have taken that bottle and sold it. But no, you want to pour it on Jesus. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, why? And I love what Jesus does here. Because the disciples said, look at what the disciples said, why this waste? And what Jesus does here is he fights why with why. Why are you bothering this woman? Oh, I love this about Jesus. He's so smart. He gets asked a why question, and instead of responding to it, he replies with another why question. He fights why with why. This is so smart. How many times have you found in your life someone comes to you and says, why are you doing that? Why are we doing this? Oh, I know in my household the kids often say, Dad, why do we have to do the dishes? Do you know that the best response often can just be another why question back? Well, why do you think I need to feed you? Would be a good reply. Oftentimes when you're asked a why question, it's because people don't understand why you're asking them to do something or what you're trying to do. And what Jesus shows us here is the power of fighting a why with a why. And he just comes back, why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. And he continues, the poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, She did it to prepare me for burial. And then Jesus continues, truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. And I just find it fascinating that here we are now, 2,000 years after the fact, and we're remembering and we're celebrating this grateful gal. We're not told her name. We don't know who she was by name. We can't point to that. But what we can do is we're still living out this promise that Jesus made, that wherever my gospel is preached, this story will be told. And guess what we're doing today? We are telling this story. So this woman comes and she does what Jesus calls a beautiful thing. And we can sit back and we can be like, well, why would she do this? Here's another why question. Why would she do this? There's got to be a something that's compelled her to go and do this. Maybe you're thinking, maybe she was rich. Maybe she had this whole shelf of rich, expensive perfumes lined up on shelves so she could just grab a bottle. And to her, tipping this bottle out was one of hundreds. So it could seem extravagant to the disciples, but to her it was one of many. Who knows? We can ask this question, why? But what I want to tell you is I think we can find the answer. And some of you might have picked up on it because of what we've titled this week, right? Memoirs of a Grateful Gal. Maybe she was grateful. And what I love about this account is we really see this woman, this gal who is incredibly grateful. And what's remarkable, in the New Testament, there's 4 accounts of Jesus' life. You might know this. There's Matthew, there's Mark, there's Luke, and there's John. All 4 of these accounts were written about Jesus' life from 4 different people. Matthew, he was a tax collector who followed Jesus, who was an eyewitness to what went on. He wrote an account. Then there was an account written by Mark. Mark was close friends with Peter, who was, one of Jesus' closest disciples. And what people will suggest today is that Mark got all his information from Peter. So when Mark's writing this account, it's really taken from Peter's testimony and Peter's account of what took place, because Peter was right there. Then there's Luke. Luke was a doctor, and Luke tells us that he went out and he researched and he wanted to write an orderly account of everything that took place. And then the 4th one was written by a man called John. And again, John was one of the disciples. He was right there following Jesus when all of this took place. It was Matthew, Levi, whose account we're looking at now. And what's interesting is all 4 of these authors have an account that's fairly similar to this one. All 4 of those writers talk about a woman who anointed Jesus with expensive perfume. And some scholars, a decent number, a high percentage of scholars would say that all 4 of these accounts are talking about the same event. I'm not convinced, I don't totally know if all 4 are talking about the exact same event, because all of them have some details and others have other details. And so you could say, well, this could be the same, or those ones might be the same. And when we don't know, in fact, it was quite custom at the time if someone came into someone's house that they might get some level of anointing. So it's not too far off to think that, hey, this could have happened on separate occasions. But what I am convinced of, after doing a whole lot of research and reading these accounts for myself, and maybe you could do that. If you're someone who wants to figure this out for yourself, just look up the 4 accounts. If you don't know where they are, just Google woman anoints Jesus with perfume, and you'll find the readings for where you can read about it in Matthew, where you can read about it in Mark, where you can read about it in Luke, and where you can read about it in John. But what I'm convinced of is the account that's written in Matthew is the exact same as what's written about in John. I think these 2 accounts are definitely of the same person and talking about the same event. So what I want us to do to help us understand what Matthew is talking about is to go over to the John and see what John has to say about this, because John gives us some details that Matthew doesn't, just as Matthew gave us some details that we won't see in John. See, Matthew told us whose house this was at. He said that it took place at Simon the leper's house. John doesn't tell us that, but John tells us a few other things. What does John tell us about this? He says a dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. And so what John tells us is that there's a special dinner that's being served for Jesus, and Lazarus was one of the people who was sitting around this table. And what I want you to capture is that this account is captured in John chapter 12. And this is where John writes about this. Do you want to know what happened in John chapter 11? In John chapter 11, there's the account of Lazarus being dead. Mary and her sister Martha, they call out to Jesus because they say, our brother is sick, can you come and help? And when Jesus hears this news, he stays where he is for 3 whole days, and then he makes the journey to Bethany, to where Lazarus is already buried in the tomb. And you go, well, hang on a minute, if Lazarus is buried in the tomb, how's he sitting here having dinner that's been prepared that Martha's serving if he died in the previous chapter? That would be a very good question. But if you've read that chapter, you'll know that we see one of the most incredible miracles take place when Jesus calls Lazarus out of the grave, and Lazarus comes out of the grave and comes back to life. It is an absolutely incredible account. And what I love about that account is it really is a physical picture of a spiritual reality that takes place for all of us. That we're all dead in our sin, and Jesus comes and he calls us out. When he calls Lazarus out, he says, Lazarus, take off your grave clothes. And that's a picture of Jesus when he calls us to himself to say, hey, take off all of that way of living that you used to live, and rather here's a new set of clothes for you to wear. And so what we see in this transition from chapter 11 to chapter 12 is we see this incredible miracle take place. This miracle where Martha and Mary were upset and they were desperate for their brother to be healed. And then Jesus heals them. And so what John does is he gives us some more details about this event, about this meal that's taking place. He doesn't tell us that it's at Simon the leper's house, but he tells us that Martha's serving, because we know that Martha's good at serving, and we're told that Lazarus is among those who ate with him. And then John gives us a little bit more detail, because he says then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from the essence of nard. See, what John does is he tells us who this unnamed woman is that Matthew writes about. He says, no, this isn't just any woman. This is Mary. This is Mary, the sister of Lazarus. This is Mary who wanted Jesus to come and to heal her brother. This is Mary whose brother Jesus brought back from the dead in her presence. This is Mary, someone who has so much to be thankful for, so much to be grateful for. This woman that came with the alabaster jar didn't just come for no apparent reason. She came because of an incredible miracle that took place, that she saw, that meant so much to her because it involved her own brother and the restoration of her own brother's life. And so what we're told here is what it was Mary who took the 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance. It's remarkable. Because what we see take place here is the reason why Mary would take something so expensive and use it to anoint Jesus. Because really, when you think about this, when you've got someone you know who's sick, there's no price you wouldn't pay to see them healed, right? If you have got a close family member with a terminal disease, you'd do absolutely anything you could to see that diagnosis change, to see that terminal diagnosis totally removed. And that's what Jesus did for Lazarus. And so here we have Mary being incredibly grateful. But the only reason we can see this is if we actually go back and we look at chapter 11, where Jesus performs this incredible miracle. If we just read this without that wider context, you'll actually miss what's going on here. And I think if Mary was to come back and we were to read the memoirs of a grateful gal, I think she'd say this. I think she'd say, I didn't do it because I had to. I did it because I wanted to. I didn't pour out this expensive perfume and pour it on Jesus' head or rub it on Jesus' feet because I had to. No. You've got to understand, I wanted to. Because of all of Jesus had done for me, this was my natural response to him. Because he had come and healed my brother and restored my brother's life and given him a second chance at life, how could I not give him everything that I had? He came and he did so much for me. Therefore, I wanted to do this for him. You see, Mary was never instructed. Jesus never said, Mary, you know that expensive bottle of perfume you've got? Can you go and bring that and anoint me? That'd be a nice thing for you to do. That's not what took place. She, out of a grateful heart, because of all God had done for her, went and took what was likely the most expensive thing she had at her home, and she came and she poured it out upon Jesus because she was so grateful for all that he'd done for her. I think should tell us very clearly, I didn't have to do this. I wanted to do this. You see, there's a powerful shift there. A lot of people think, remember when we talked about the memoirs of a little man, and he was climb. He was a climber, right? And a lot of us can spend like, I've got to do. No. What the memoirs of a grateful gal would tell us, I don't do this because I have to. I don't do this to climb. I do this because of what Jesus has already done for me. See, I think if she was to write her memoir, she should say, God will never ask anything from you until you know what he's done for you. God will never ask you to do something until you know what he's done for you. See, a lot of people think, I've got to do this to prove myself to God. That if I do this, then God will love me. If I do this, I'll be worthy to God. If I do this, I'll show God that I'm valuable. If I do this, I can work my way to him. But that's not the way the gospel works. We talked about that, right? When we looked at the memoirs of a little man. God will never ask anything of us. Rather, he'll want us to know all that he's done for us. Well, we can see this if we go right back to the Old Testament. When God was calling the Israelites, the Jewish people, out of Egypt, where they've been in captivity, where they've been in slavery for 400 years, where they've been abused, where they've been oppressed, where they've been absolutely brutalized by the Egyptians. And God led the Israelites out of Egypt, and through powerful miracles. Because of his power, he led them out of Egypt. And he parted the sea so they could cross it. And he fed them in the desert. And he took care of them in the desert. And when they were in the desert, after he had taken them out of Egypt, God then took Moses up the mountain and gave Moses the law, if you know this. And what's so interesting is God didn't say, hey guys, here's the law. If you obey all my laws, if you do everything that I say, I will then lead you out of Egypt. No. What God did first was he pulled his people. He led his people out of Egypt. Then he said, hey, this is how I want you to live. Now you know that I am for you. Now you know that I care for you. Now I've taken you out of oppression. Now I've taken you out of the brutal circumstances in which you are living. Now you know that I am on your side. Let me give you some rules to live by. Because I'm not giving you these rules to try and squash you. I'm giving these rules because I want to help you. I'm not giving you these rules because I want to take life away from you. I'm giving you these rules because I want you to experience life and life to its full. And if you look through some of these rules, some of these laws that they were given, man, it's absolutely remarkable how powerful these were for the time in which they were given. There's rules about hygiene. There's even rules about isolation when someone's sick. There's rules about what food you should eat and what food you shouldn't eat. And again, this was because if you ate certain food, you're a lot more likely to get sick. See, it's in these laws we can actually see God caring for his people. These laws weren't trying to squash his people. They were actually trying to help his people. But God didn't ask them to follow the law or to adhere to the law until God had first proven to them that he was for them, that he wants to get them out of oppression, that he wants to get them out of slavery, that he wants to take them into a brand new land. You see, God will never ask anything from you. Rather, He wants you to know all that He's done for you. Because what happens is when we can start to grasp all that God's done for us, we don't have a problem giving things to God. The way we've been saying that through the series is simply this way, right? When grace gets you, grace changes you. When grace gets a hold of you, grace changes you. And what we see in Mary's life was grace got a hold of her because she saw Jesus do something so miraculous, something so special. She saw how much He cared for her and for her brother and for her family. And grace got a hold of her, and grace changed her. And that's why she could go into her cupboard at home and get most likely the most expensive thing that she had and pour it out upon Jesus. Why? Because when grace gets you, grace changes you. We've seen that throughout this series. Let's do a quick recap. We started in week 1 by looking at the memoirs of a blind man. We had blind Bartimaeus. And we see Jesus come and heal Bartimaeus and give Bartimaeus sight. And what did Bartimaeus do? Once his sight was there, he threw off his coat and he walked off and he started to follow Jesus because he knew that Jesus was for him. So why would I stay where I am when I can go forward and follow the one who can do this for me? Because I know all He's done for me. I have received His grace, and it changed me. And I no longer want to sit by the side of the road and beg. Because of His grace, I'm going to now follow Him. No matter what it costs me, no matter how difficult it might be, no matter what I've got to step away from to go and do it, because His grace has changed me. Then we looked at the memoirs of a courageous Pharisee, a Pharisee who was so intimidated about what other people would think. A Pharisee who had very real questions. He wanted to know who Jesus was. He saw something in him that says, man, this guy must have come from God. And then he looked at Jesus and knew there was something special, something unique about him. But he didn't want his friends and his peers to see him because he had such a standing. So he was a Pharisee. That the first time he went to Jesus, he went under the cloak of darkness. And he went to Jesus at night. But what we see as we read through those accounts of him going back to Jesus was after Jesus' death, this Pharisee, Nicodemus, was willing to go and bury Jesus' body in front of everyone else at great personal cost. He was willing to be seen taking the body of Jesus and burying it in a dignified, meaningful manner. Why? Because in those conversations with Jesus, grace got him. And he went from someone who was being afraid of what people thought to someone who says, no, I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to stand up publicly for what I know to be true. Because when grace got hold of Nicodemus, grace changed Nicodemus. In week 3, we looked at the memoirs of a thirsty woman, this woman who Jesus met by the well. This woman who was an outcast by society, a woman who was rejected by everyone else, a woman who made this journey alone every single day rather than with a group and a collective of people. But when she met Jesus and Jesus had this conversation with her at the well, what did she do? She ran back to the town and she said to people, there is this man who could be the Messiah. You have to come and see. And she really was the first evangelist helping point people towards Jesus, because she had this moment around the well where she experienced grace and grace changed her. Rather than avoiding the crowd, she ran back to the crowds. Rather than trying to hide from people, she went back to the people that had despised her, and rather than despising them back, she went back and said, I have got good news. I've met the one who might be the Messiah. You've got to come with me. Why? Because when grace gets you, grace changes you, and grace got her that day by the well. Then we looked at the memoirs of a little man. Remember this? The little man who had to climb up the tree in order to see over the crowd so he could see Jesus. And Zacchaeus climbed up the tree so that he could see Jesus. And Jesus went to that tree, and Zacchaeus has spent his whole life climbing, and Jesus said, hey Zacchaeus, why don't you come down? And we're going back to your place for lunch. And when Zacchaeus had that lunch and he spent some time with Jesus, he got to the end of that and he said, Jesus, I'm going to take half of my wealth and I'm going to give it to the poor. And if I've cheated anyone, if I've ripped off anyone, if I've taken advantage of anyone, I'm going to pay them back 4 times what I owe them. He had this incredible turnaround of someone who was greedy to someone who was incredibly generous. Someone who has been doing all he could to climb the ladder of wealth and success, actually saying, I want to give it all away now. Why? Because when grace got him, when he had lunch with Jesus that day and he experienced the transformational power of God's grace, grace got him and grace changed him. It changed him. And then last week we looked at the memoirs of an exemplified woman. The woman who was brought out naked, full of embarrassment, full of shame. And they wanted to make an example of her. And then the group of Pharisees and teachers of the law looked at Jesus and said, hey, this woman's been caught in the act of adultery. The law says that we should stone her. What do you say that we should do? And Jesus gave that incredible response. Sure, but he who has never sinned cast the first stone. And slowly but surely all of that crowd that wanted to stone her walked away. And then this lady who deserved death, she had this moment of grace where she stood with Jesus and Jesus looked at her and he asked her, where are your accusers? Who condemns you? And she said, no one. And then Jesus said, well, neither do I. Now go and sin no more. And the reality is, we don't know what happened to this woman from this point on. Well, we don't know her name. Well, we can't find her biography. We don't know what took place in her life. And there's a chance. There's a chance that she went away from that and said, phew, I got away with it this time, and went back to living the way that she'd always lived. But I think there's a much better chance that she went away from that experience and said, man, I deserve death, but rather I've been given life. And as a result of that, I'm going to do all I can to honor this new life that I've been given, to thank the one who stood up for me when everyone else wanted to accuse me and kill me. But we really don't know. But that's what I think happened. Why? Because when grace gets you, grace changes you. And you can't tell me that grace didn't capture that woman's heart that day. When she was at the lowest point, when she just wanted the world to suck her in, Jesus got alongside her and stood up for her in the face of all of that adversity. Oh, I think she would have been radically transformed by that grace. Because when grace gets you, grace changes you. And when we look at the story we've looked at today, this woman, Mary, experienced the incredible grace of God. When Jesus came and he called her brother back to life. And that grace changed her. Because now this expensive perfume that she had at home that she might have put on for special occasions, I don't know how she used it. But she said, no, I don't deserve this because of all he's done for me. I want to use the best that I've got to anoint him, to thank him. And this incredible, worshipful, powerful act, she poured out this perfume on the one that had done so much for her. It's incredible. But the story still has a little bit to go. See, the way John records it, he doesn't actually say the disciples who were indignant. He identifies one. He says, but Judas, the disciple who would soon betray Jesus, said, the perfume was worth a year's wages. That's how much this perfume was worth. If we put that in today's term, what's it? $50,000 maybe. That perfume's worth $50,000. And she just poured it out in a moment. Judas is saying it should have been sold and the money should have been given to the poor. Judas was the one who was indignant. Maybe the other disciples jumped on board, but John is very clear here. Judas was the one. Maybe because John was one of the other disciples, so he wanted to finger point. But he's very clear. Judas was the one really powerfully saying, what's going on? That was worth a year's wages. And you know what can happen when there's a few people and one person says, hey, this. It's easier for others to jump on. And I think that's what took place. Judas started and the others joined. They go, man, year's wages, that's a lot of money. We could have done so much good with this. But then John adds a comment. Because John's writing this. He wasn't sitting there on the day taking notes. But he writes this after seeing everything that took place. And he's looking back on everything that happened. And he reminds us, not that Judas cared for the poor. He was a thief. They didn't know that at the time, because I'm sure if the other disciples knew that at the time, they would have confronted Judas about it. Something would have happened. And since Judas was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. See, what Judas was saying is he was upset. He was indignant that it had taken place, because he said, if we sold that, we could have filled the money bag, and I could have helped myself. I was in the money bag, not simply because we could have helped the poor. And I think if we were to get the memoirs from this grateful gal, I think should tell us this. I think should tell us that what stands out in this account. What stood out now that I look back on it? What stands out? If Mary was saying, what if we were to give some of your memoirs, she'd say, what stood out for me so much? And I probably didn't fully appreciate it at the time, was the contrast between Judas and myself. Because in this moment, we've got this grateful woman, Mary, who wants to be absolutely over the top generous towards Jesus, because grace had got a hold of her, and because grace had changed her, and God had done so much for her. She wanted to give so much back to him, and here she has been incredibly generous. And yet we have Judas also in the room. Judas, just a few people over. Judas, who has a very different approach, who has a very different he looks at this through a very different lens, and he's saying, man, this is an opportunity where I could have made money for myself. This is the opportunity where I could have put something in my back pocket. And we see Judas looking at this through the lens of greed. And so we have this woman, Mary, who's trying to do something incredibly generous. And then we have Judas, who's trying to look at it and say, no, this is an opportunity for me to be greedy. So we have these two people who are looking at this situation from very, very different vantage points. And what's so interesting, what's crazy about us, if we follow Judas's story, it's just after this that Judas actually goes and sells Jesus. He agrees to betray Jesus for money, right? For silver coins. And what we see is Judas who's in this interaction, and Judas is there, and Judas is greasy. Judas is greedy, and what does his greed lead to? His greed leads to death, because we read forward just a little bit, and what happens to Judas? As soon as Judas betrays Jesus, what does he do? He goes and he takes his own life, because greed leads to death. Judas, after selling Jesus, realized, man, the brutality of his greed, and it costs him his life. He takes his own life. And if we contrast this with Mary, we see Mary, who's incredibly generous. Mary, who pours out everything she's got. And what does Mary do? Mary finds life. Her name goes on to eternity. And why? Because we're told by Matthew that the story will be told not just here, not just in this moment, not just around the town of Bethany, but wherever the gospel is proclaimed, this woman's story will be told. And in her story, and her account just goes on and on and on, because generosity brings life. It brings life. Naturally, we tend to be greedy, but what the transformational power of grace does to us is it changes our heart, and it helps us no longer to be greedy, but rather to be generous. And as I look at this account, and I think about, man, what we can learn from it, there is so much we can take away. But I think the most powerful thing we can take away is the power of a generous spirit. Because generosity is always going to lead to life. And look, I haven't got time today to talk about the power of generosity. I haven't got the time today to get into this. And we'll find the time this year to get into this. I promise you. But right now, I don't have the time. But what I want to say is this. Is when grace gets you, grace changes you. When grace gets you, grace transforms you. And I honestly believe that one of the most powerful ways we can see grace transform a human heart is when it takes our greedy desires and say, no, I don't want to use what I've got for me because it's not about my kingdom. Rather, I want to use what I've got and I want to give it to Jesus because it's all about His kingdom. And I'm not going to do this in order to climb my way to Him. I'm not going to do this in order to get something from Him. I'm going to do this out of a heart of thanksgiving, a heart that is so grateful, a heart that is so overcome by His incredible grace. How could that not be my natural response to Him? Because God hasn't asked me to do anything. Rather, He's just opened my eyes to all that He's done for me. And when I can see all that He's done for me, I therefore want to do all that I can for Him. And so my question as we close out the series is simply this. Has God's grace got you? Has His grace got you? Maybe as we've looked through some of these characters, God's grace has got hold of you because you see yourself in that person. But has God's grace got you? Are you able to live a generous life like Mary that's going to lead to life? Or are you trapped? Do you know when you look deep inside yourself, you're living a greedy life like Judas? Because I promise you, if that's you, that is going to lead to death. And there's some people, and you're sitting here and you're watching this, and I think there's people that fall into three different camps. There's some of you are watching this, and the reality is, man, God's grace has got you. God's grace has got you. And you're living a merry life. You're like, man, God's grace has so got me. God's grace has so transformed me that everything I've got's now His. Because, man, when I can't comprehend, nothing I can do is good enough. I can never, ever, ever outgive God. I can never thank Him enough for all He's done for me. And I don't thank Him through a one-off gift or through one little thing that I do. No. Every area of my life is now used to honor Him because I am so grateful for all He's done for me. And if that's you, man, that's amazing. That's awesome. That is where you want to be. And there's some others. And God's grace has at some point in your life got you. But there's been this battle going on. And you've got to the place where actually, I'm falling back into that trap of being greedy. I know about God's grace. I've experienced some of God's grace. But for some reason, the trappings of this world are pulling me back. Can I encourage you to go back to that place where God's grace got you? Maybe it was a passage in the scriptures that you're reading. Maybe it was an account about something. Maybe it was a lyrics of a song. Maybe it was someone else's actions, or because of what they've done for you, you experience God's grace in the most powerful and the most profound way. Can you go back to that? Reread that account. Remember that person. Play that song. Do whatever it is you need to do. Because God's grace will transform us when God's grace gets hold of us. And the humanness in us wants to fight that because of what we see in the here and now. But the problem with that is it's always going to lead to death. And we've got to let that grace transform us. And others, you are watching this, you're like, Clint, I just don't get it. I've never seen, I've never heard, I've never understood God's grace the way that you're talking about. God's grace has never really captured me. And I'm trying to think of the best advice that I can give you, because a lot of people say, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. But I don't think that's the way of the kingdom, because remember, God said to Zacchaeus, come down, don't keep climbing. But if that's you, can I just encourage you to maybe pray this simple prayer? God, if your grace is as overwhelming and as compelling as what Clint's talking about, please help me see it. Please open my eyes. Please soften my heart. God, please reveal your grace to me. I just want to encourage you to just pray that prayer. And pray it over and over and over and over. Because I think if you pray that prayer, God will answer it. I think if you've got the courage to earnestly say, and don't just pray it as a throwaway prayer, but pray it because we're told if we seek Him with all of our heart, we will find Him. And I tell you, if you open up and say, okay, God, I don't understand this grace. I can't comprehend it. I don't know what it's like. But Clint talks about it with so much passion. And then other people have spoken about it. I've seen the way it's transformed people. And God, I want that grace to get hold of me. Just pray, God, help me to experience your grace. God, take off the blindness from my eyes. Remove the hardness from my heart. Help me to get a picture of how incredible your grace is. Because I think if you pray that prayer, God will in fact answer it. And when grace gets you, grace will change you. Let me pray to wrap this up. Heavenly Father, man, we thank you so much for your grace. We thank you for just the enormity of it, for the richness and the thickness of it. And Father, I know that everyone listening to this is in a different place in terms of their spiritual walk with you. But Father, I pray that your grace will capture every single one of them. I pray that they'll be overwhelmed by your incredible grace. And Father, I know that when grace really gets a hold of us, grace changes us. And Father, one of the most powerful ways that transformation takes place is we step out of people who are being greedy and we step into becoming someone who is generous, like we see with Mary in this story. And so, Father, I pray you'll help us to be a generous people. Not because we're trying to get something from you, but because we understand all that you've done for us. And it's just our natural heart response. It's our natural reaction because of what you've done for us. God, we want to be a people who are generous to you because we understand how incredibly generous you were to us. We thank you that no matter what we do, we can never outgive you. So thank you for giving us so much. Thank you for sending us your Son to die so that we could have life. Thank you. In Jesus' name we pray these things. Amen, amen, amen. And thank you so much for joining us for this Memoir series. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I hope you have a great week ahead. We look back to seeing you next week as we launch into something brand new. We'll see you then. Bye.